Hello, good evening. Wow, it's a delight to see so many of you here tonight. My name's Julian Harrison. I'm one of the curators of medieval manuscripts here at the British Library. And we're delighted to welcome tonight Dan Jones, historian, author, presenter. And I wanted to just start today's proceedings by telling you we've got a world exclusive today because, unknown to Dan, Dan has written a new book.
Oh, yes.
Now, you may not have noticed, it hasn't been mentioned at all.
I've tried to be modest about this one.
By his publicist, it's not been on the Sunday Times bestseller list, but in case you're interested, tonight we're going to be talking about Dan Jones, Henry V, the astonishing rise of England's greatest warrior king. And I think you're going to be signing copies of it outside.
I certainly am, yes.
So,
Thank you, Julian.
And as part of tonight's proceedings, I'm going to ask Dan some questions about how he came to write this new biography of Henry V. I'm also going to turn the floor over to you guys at some stage, so there'll be a microphone going round, so we'll be very pleased and delighted to answer your questions as well. I'd love to say hello also to everybody who's watching online tonight. Delighted that you're going to be joining us as well, and if you would also like to ask your questions, put them in the chat box and we'll get around to answering a selection of those as well. Now, Dan has been given versions of this talk for like 2 or 3 weeks now.
It's always new.
It's always new. It's always new. It's all stuff. I love what you say at the beginning. It says, enjoy the ride. So obviously, that's what we're going to be doing this evening. So I'm going to kick off a couple of questions I'm going to ask Dan. So first of all, just a general question. Can you remember, Dan, what first inspired your love of medieval history? Was it
I can remember, Julian. It was absolute blind luck and heedlessness, carelessness, if anything. So when I was 18 years old, just a couple of years ago, this is the summer of 1999. And I'm going to say June-ish 1999. It was my last day at school. And I'd been offered a place to read history at Cambridge. No one from my school, sort of in living memory, I think, had been, so we didn't really know what we were doing. And I went to my teacher, Mr. Green, my history teacher, who was a fantastic teacher, because a form had been sent to me saying, you're going up in October, what do you want to study? The Cambridge Tripos at that time was pretty open-ended. You could choose almost anything, effectively, 1 or 2 parameters. And we'd done Tudors and Nazis and nothing else for A-level. So he's sort of halfway out the door because it's the end of term, and so am I. But I'm like, I've got to fill this form in, man. What should I write? And he goes, I don't know, put medieval. Tick, fine. Folded it up, went down, posted it, went down Victoria Wine, 8 cans of Foster's for a £5, down the park. It was fantastic. And I didn't think about this form for another few months. And then, it is literally almost 25 years to the day. I went up to Pembroke College, Cambridge, and my director of studies, John Parry, said, so I see you want to be a medievalist. Oh, yes, very good. Do I? Right. And he said, go off to Sydney, Sussex. Your supervisor is Helen Castor. I'm sure lots of you here tonight will know who Helen Castor is, a brilliant, brilliant medievalist. She is now as she was then. So she, for my first 2 terms as an undergraduate, taught me English medieval history. And it was, you really sort of went from Magna Carta to Henry V, pretty much. And so that was the grounding, and she was such a brilliant supervisor. And that school of medieval history in Cambridge at that time, sort of overseen by Christine Carpenter, there's a sort of apostolic succession running through to K.B. Macfarlane there. This was a really interesting and exciting medieval sort of department within the history faculty. So I just came back for more and more and more. And I thought once I'd finished, right, well, I'll go and be a lawyer now. But I downloaded the papers for law school, and there was so much paperwork. It's a very good test as to whether you want to be a lawyer or not, so I stuck with history. That's my story.
And sort of following on from that, do you even remember when you may have first encountered the subject of your new biography, Henry V?
Well, it would have been the second, either the penultimate or the last essay you did in Tripos in part 1 back then. There were 8-week terms, and you did an essay every week. Typically, you would hand it in on a Wednesday and have your supervision on the Thursday. So it must have been the 7th week or the 8th week of term that we did Henry V. And quite what the essay title was, I now forget, but essentially the proposition was this man England's greatest warrior king, you know? So, and the answer is yes, pretty much. But as to why it's yes, that's the interesting question, and it takes you into ideas of what was expected from a king in the later Middle Ages. You know, what were the conceived, perceived elemental duties of kingship? Represented as it on the Great Seal. You know, on the one side you have the king as judge, on the other side you have the king as warrior. A simple job, therefore, defined in these two terms, but not easy to perform. So what does it take to perform those two roles well, to combine them well, and how does this character, this man, seem to perform the job so perfectly? You know, not only is that the judgment of most historians who've looked at his reign, but there was the judgment of people in his day, thereafter, characters like Henry VIII. So it's a really interesting case study in English kingship in the later Middle Ages, in the same way that Richard II's reign is a great case study in kingship in the later Middle Ages because he gets it totally wrong. Yeah, so that would be when I first encountered him.
And at what point in your career did you think to yourself, I need to write this book? This is a story that has to be told. And was it a challenge to you to actually get to grips with that particular story?
Well, when I started writing the history books, the first book I wrote was about the Peasants' Revolt. The second book I wrote was called The Plantagenets, and that came out in 2012. And thereafter I wrote a book called The Hollow Crown, in the US known as The Wars of the Roses, and so Plantagenets finished with the deposition of Richard II in 1399. The Hollow Crown began the story with the marriage of Henry V and Catherine de Valois in 1420, because from Catherine de Valois you start to trace the Tudor line, and I knew I was going to end the story in 1525. That left a Henry V-shaped gap, Henry IV-shaped gap between the two books. And I was sort of aware that one day, all being well, I would come back and sort of complete not quite a trilogy, but a triptych of works. When that day was, I've gone down several avenues within the medieval writing I've done. Crusades and Templars on the one hand, I did Powers and Thrones, the big sort of survey book on the other. And then I came back to this story, it's published this year, but I've been working on it for sort of 3 years, as you do with most projects, because I felt that not only was it a good time to complete the set, if you like, that I felt personally ready to write a medieval biography, and particularly of a character who I felt deserved a good biography, but I think it's also an interesting time to be writing case studies in power. And if we take Henry V as a great case study of leadership in a time of crisis, of seemingly, you know, a realm divided, politically sort of partisan, struggling with the after effects of a pandemic, failed or at least very expensive foreign policies that seem to have no kind of off ramps to them. It seems impossible that anyone will come along who can fix a broken politics, and then suddenly along comes this one figure who seems to solve everything like that, who has a great apprenticeship, who triangulates between the different leadership styles of his predecessors, who is lucky, who is, you know, is competent, who has a degree of personal magnetism. That's the alluring political fantasy of our day for many people. And so it's an interesting time to write such a case study, even if all the issues are really different between then and now. It's still, that fulfills the role of history as sort of interesting reflection on present concerns.
And as a subject for a biography, I mean, and you're not the first person to have written about Henry V.
There was a playwright, but I forget his name.
Earl of Oxford.
I think that's the one, yeah.
That's the guy.
There's aliens on Oak Island. Yeah, sorry, go on.
I'm just wondering, like, were there any specific perceptions or preconceptions of Henry that you felt you wanted to challenge, or perhaps as a result of your research into writing this book, you know, came to light and you felt were really important to emphasise?
Well, there was a question that I wanted to think about There were sort of broadly two, one structural and one historiographical. So the historiographical one was, well, it's interesting, isn't it, that Henry, as I've said, in his lifetime, thereafter, for a long, long time, what was considered the acme, the epitome, the paradigm of late English medieval kingship. And, even you got someone like K.B. Macfarlane, who describes him as the greatest man that ever ruled England. And Macfarlane wasn't given to, judge, shows of over-enthusiasm, unlike me. And then suddenly, late 20th, really early 21st century, you have this sort of backlash against Henry, that he was cold, callous, brutal man, that he wasn't a nice guy, that this, the stain of killing the captives at Agincourt, outweighs him actually performing exactly the role that everyone wanted from a king at the time. So I felt that there was an interesting historiographical case against Henry that was growing that I thought actually needed to be sort of pushed back against. The other interesting thing about Henry that I thought was that most biographies of Henry, apart from the Earl of Oxford's, are not balanced very well. That this is a man who lived only till the age of 35, who became king at the age of 26, but in most historians' lives of Henry, he becomes king in chapter 2. Do you know what I mean? So you were missing out on the formative bit of his life, and that's the wrong shape. Shakespeare had the right shape. It's just that his concerns, being essentially dramatic, are such that he wants you to have Prince Hal, the wastrel, versus King Henry, the responsible. And it's a genius portrait over the three plays. The historical view of Henry, I felt, should actually be weighted like that we should feel as much of Henry's apprenticeship, his childhood, before he's heir to the throne, his apprenticeship as heir to the throne, and then his kingship. These should be balanced better. And so in this book, he becomes king almost exactly at the halfway point. So we have much more of a kind of a journey through his childhood, his apprenticeship, his preparations to become king, and then you start to understand with a little more depth who this king is and why he acts as he does when he does.
So essentially, because he wasn't born as a prince, was he? He wasn't destined to be king as a young child. So remind us, who were his parents?
So Henry was born on 16th of September 1386 at 11:22 a.m., as was established much later by an astrologer looking for the causes of his greatness in the peregrinations of the stars, and having to fix a date very, very precisely to do that. He was born to be the heir to the greatest noble house of the land, the House of Lancaster. His great-grandfather was Edward III. His grandfather was Edward III's third son, John of Gaunt. His father was Henry Bolingbroke. Now, if our Henry V, was born to be king of anywhere, it's probably Castile, because John of Gaunt had a claim to Castile and was sort of busy trying to enforce it. But that seemed vanishingly unlikely. It was pretty unlikely he was going to end up as king of England either. But had things gone the conventional way, he would have ended up being Duke of Lancaster, and that would have been, no small deal. That would be the premier nobleman in the land. But things didn't go that way because of Richard II's reign in 1399.
And his mother, tell us a little about her.
Well, his mother, I think, is an underappreciated influence on Henry. I mean, so his father, Bolingbroke, is, well, maybe we can talk a bit more about Bolingbroke. But his mother, Mary de Bohun, 16 years old when he's born, from a long-standing English noble house herself. The mother to 6 children, 4 boys and 2 girls, eventually dies in childbirth in her mid-20s. But an extraordinarily sort of cultured, pious matriarch of a great household. So that this itinerant household, often based in Peterborough, in which Henry grows up as a young boy, is a house full of books, full of beautifully illustrated liturgical texts. It's a place where there's so much music. Mary is a musician herself. There are orders in the records for guitar strings and harp strings and paper, parchment on which to write music, and there are animals and exotic pets. Some of them brought back by Bolingbroke when he's been away on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. There are visitors, there are gifts. This is a lively, noble household in which Henry receives a conventional education, but it's the books and the music that you see come back throughout his life. And we often think of Henry as this, just hard-nosed warrior, but what you see throughout his French campaigns when he's king, he's always taking a stack of books away on holiday with him, and often borrowing them to do so and then not giving them back. And he borrows them from his aunt, and she's, where's my book about King Arthur? But you can also trace his interests from his reading, and that's interesting. So particularly at the end of his life, he's reading a lot about crusading, he's reading books about the First Crusade and so on, and commissioning books as well. So that's Mary's influence on him.
And his father's influence.
And Bolingbroke is also sort of around and about, although more about than around, if you see what I mean. So Bolingbroke is, and as Helen Castor's new book, The Eagle and the Heart, which comes out next week, is so brilliantly clear. This is a dual portrait she does of Richard II and Henry IV. Bolingbroke was, a great knightly, noble figure. Sort of dashing, handsome, charming, popular, talented, military, but also sort of courtly. He rode jousts against Boucicaut, the great French knight, who was himself reputed to be able to do backflips in full armour and jump on his horse from a standing start. He'd been in battle at the age of 12. Well, as a young man, Bolingbroke rides in the lists against Boucicaut 10 times and performs well. Good reports are written back. He goes on crusade against the pagans in Prussia with the Teutonic Knights. He goes to Jerusalem as a pilgrim. He's a very, very highly regarded guy and a sort of paragon of chivalry himself. So that he's around less than Henry's mother. And once Bolingbroke falls foul of Richard II in 1398, this famous scene from Shakespeare's Richard II, where Bolingbroke and Mowbray are set against each other in the duel at Coventry, which is then aborted by Richard, Bolingbroke's then exiled. He doesn't take our Henry into exile with him. He takes his younger brother Thomas, future Duke of Clarence, into exile. So growing up, he's sort of there. And I think there's a great respect that Henry has that you see when he's prince for his father, but I'm not sure that they understand each other especially well.
Sorry. I've already touched on this. So, there's this kind of thing about nature against nurture, and there's this idea that, you're destined partly by who you encounter as a young boy. I'm just wondering whether you can actually trace some things that happened as he was a young boy into his later life and into what happened even when he became monarch.
Well, I think you can. I think you, in a sense, you have to think you can if you want to write a medieval biography, because the whole idea of a medieval biography is in some way a contradiction in terms, if we mean biography in the modern sense. I say this a lot. My favourite biography in the modern sense is Melvyn Bragg's 87 biography of Richard Burton. A fantastic psychological portrait, but it draws on thousands of papers of Burton's own speech and thought recorded contemporaneously. You just don't have evidence, as you know, Julian, you don't have that sort of evidence in the Middle Ages for anyone. Even William Marshall, really, it's not the same. What scraps you do have, what evidence you do have from childhood, I think you do still have to match up to adult activity. So if I talk about Mary de Boon's household being, full of books, well, we know it is, and then you see Henry reading when he's older, it's perfectly possible he thought, God, I hate those books my mum reads. It's like I was reading all the Jack Reachers and he wants to read, Knausgard or something like that. But for the purposes of a biography, I think you have to see those connections across time. Otherwise, you have no story at all, and then you're not really doing your job as a biographer. But the other great influence we should really just mention on Henry, because I think it's really important and talks to your question a little bit, is the influence of Richard II.
Yeah.
Because Henry's born in 1386. This is the beginning of Richard II's real period of delinquency. And 1386, the French Armada is looming south just off the south coast of England. There's the great crisis of 87, 88, the appellant crisis. And then by the time Henry is sort of 10, 11 years old, Richard's tyranny has begun. I mean, the Revenge Parliament of 1397, when Richard begins this program of either killing, exiling, just stamping into submission his own great nobles, Henry's got a front row seat for it. You know, the night before the Revenge Parliament, Henry is at a rented house. His father's rented on just outside London, which Richard comes to a sort of party. And we know that Henry and Thomas have new clothes made for the occasion. So they see Richard, you know, preparing for this tyranny with his whole army of Cheshire archers sort of swarming London to intimidate everyone. Henry's there for that. Once his father's exiled, Richard takes him to Ireland as a hostage, effectively. But what's interesting about Richard is that when I started putting this book together, I thought, well, this is a pretty simple case. Henry sees in Richard how not to do the job.
Yeah.
And then when he becomes king, it's pretty simple. You just do, what would Richard II have done? Okay, do the opposite. That's one playbook for kingship. But it's not as simple as that, as I found out. Because I think Henry learns something very valuable from Richard. Firstly, Richard's quite kind to him, strangely. And I think he has more respect for Richard's memory than many others do. And he has him reburied with great honour as soon as he becomes king. You know, Richard had been buried in King's Langley. Henry moves him to his tomb in Westminster. But I think he also borrows from Richard's approach to kingship. Now, Richard was hopeless as a king for all sorts of different reasons, but he was good at one thing, and that was magnificence. Magnificence and outward display, the performative aspects of kingship. And if you think about the Westminster portrait of the Wilton diptych or any of these sort of great images of Richard, all the stories of him sitting high above his court, casting his gaze around his courtiers, and if it fell upon you, you had to fall to your knees. Henry doesn't do that, but when he becomes king, you see he has a deeply ingrained instinct for public spectacle. We see it at his coronation, when, at the coronation feast, he suddenly sort of adopts this incredibly severe mien, and it's like a mask has come down that never lifts again. We see it after Agincourt and the triumphs through the streets of London, when all the Londoners are celebrating, and Henry sits in deliberate counterpoint, severe, austere, dressed in dark clothes, refusing to show off his sort of armour or the sword, the helmet he'd worn at Agincourt. All praise must just go through me to God. He's got this instinct for public performance that never leaves him. And that, I think, owes a lot to Richard.
That's really interesting. I wanted to pick up on the title of your book. So, Gracious Warrior King, and obviously that's the thing that lots of people know about Henry V. But thinking about him as a young man, can you go back and describe the first time he had a proper military encounter and what that must have been like for him?
Yes, well, he has a real military training. As soon as his father becomes king in 1399, 1400, Henry is now a heartbeat away from being king himself, and so he's got to learn to go and fight. And he's 13 years old, and he's taken on campaign to Scotland, as his brother Thomas, but nothing much comes of that. His training ground's Wales. Yeah. Rebellion of Owen Glendower. Henry Owen Glendower claims to be Prince of Wales. In fact, he makes his announcement on Henry's birthday. He's never that subtle. And Henry is sent to Wales to stake his claim to his principality. And there he learns the basics. He learns how Glendower's rebellion is a tax revolt, English officials being chased out, castles being taken from the crown, and so on and so forth. Henry has to learn how to besiege a castle, how to deploy cannon, the right ratio of men-at-arms and archers, how to beg and borrow and scrape for money, how to go to parliaments and say, yeah, I know, look, we said this last time, but we need more money, how to persuade people to carry on fighting when they've been paid for 2 months. All of these things that are going to be so useful to him when he becomes king, he learns in Wales, and he fights his first battle during this time. This warrior king only ever fights 2 battles, Shrewsbury in 1403, Agincourt in 1415. That's it. Shrewsbury is it's in some ways it's the more important one, weirdly, because he's 16 years old. He's been in Wales under the tutelage of Henry Hotspur, Henry Percy, aka Hotspur, a man a little older than his father, who is sort of cut from the similar cloth to Bolingbroke, really. He's a great warrior knight. Hotspur rebels, and with the aim of getting rid of the Lancastrians, putting a dead Richard the King, a sort of notional Richard II back on the throne. Battle takes place on the 21st of July, 1403, outside Shrewsbury. And future Henry V is commanding the rear guard, and he's seriously injured. Although the Lancastrians win the day, at some point Henry removes his helm or lifts the visor, and an arrow shot from a longbow straight into his face, and the arrowhead is buried to the depth of 6 inches in the back of his skull. Miracle, and you use that word advisedly when you're talking about the 15th century, a miracle that he survives. And then he has to have an operation to remove it. And the operation is carried out by John Bradmore, one of his father's retained surgeons. And it's a really extraordinary operation. If anyone here is ever shot with an arrow from a longbow, God forbid, first thing you should do is go to A&E. But if you can't go to A&E, you typically would push it out the other side, typically. But you can't do that when it's in your head. So they have to pull it out of the entry wound. So sorry, everybody. So Bradmore's... no one's fainted yet tonight. Bradmore's operation, and we still have the notes for the operation, which have been brilliantly sort of translated and analysed by Michael Livingston, the American historian, involves opening the entry wound by degrees, keeping it clean, honey and wine, basically. Opening by degrees, then a bespoke instrument is inserted, clamps onto the arrowhead and draws it out. All the while, Henry has to be kept still, warm, stable, ensure he doesn't go into spasm. The fear of the spasm was my greatest fear, writes Bradmore in his notes. And then the wound has to be closed up and healed. Now, Bradmore manages to do this, and he's a very brilliant surgeon. With an incredible casebook of other unlikely heroics on the operating table. But it takes 30 days. And that's 30 days that Henry has to lie in pain, in limbo between life and death. At any moment, any slip of the surgeon's hand, any chance infection, he's a goner. And at 16 years old, to endure the pain, the boredom, the knowledge that death could occur at any minute, and then not to die. Can only be speculation, but again, as I'm talking about, you have to do these things when writing medieval biography. I don't think it's too much to go from there to, well, here we have a guy who, when he becomes king, acts with this unbelievable certainty that he has been placed on earth for a reason, and that reason is to see that justice is done in every sense. And I think that it's not undue speculation to argue that this may well go back to Shrewsbury. God has saved him. Why would God save him? So that he can do something. And every time he wins, you see him say, it's just God, it's just God. Even after Agincourt, when the prisoners who haven't been massacred are being marched off to imprisonment, he puts his arm around a young Charles, Duke of Orleans. Says, don't worry, mate. This is just because you French are decadent. It's not personal. I'm just God's scourge. What do you expect? So,
exactly. The first things going through my mind, just imagine the physical and psychological impact it had on him, but also maybe the impact it had on his contemporaries, thinking that he had actually got through this absolutely astonishingly, a fatal wound almost that he was rescued from, and whether that actually changed their perspective of him and their opinion of him.
I think it's really hard for us today to put ourselves into the mindset of a world in which God's intervention is taken for granted. And we're probably unusual in that sense as Westerners, and as people. If you think back to the classic, the world of the ancient Greeks, I mean, the gods are forever getting involved and meddling, aren't they? Turning up as swans and having their way with people they fancy, or whatever. You know, still in the 15th century, although the swans are used for different purposes, their feathers are ripped out to make arrow fletchings, there's still this sense that God gets involved. And it's only now, really, that we've retreated from that mindset, but it is very hard for us to put ourselves into that world.
And he's also permanently scarred as well, isn't he?
Well, maybe. I don't know. It's usually said that the reason that there's this famous portrait of Henry in profile is because he was sort of hideously scarred from this operation at Shrewsbury on one side. But the more I think about it, the more I think maybe not. That portrait in the Royal Collection is like 16th century, so it's copied from something. We don't have the original. Is it maybe copied from a medal or a coin? That would make sense. There's a big confusion because the notes from the operation seem to suggest the arrow went in one side, and then if you take that portrait of being painted in profile as evidence, you go, well, something's wrong here. But it may be that there wasn't much of a scar. No one ever writes that there was a big scar down one side of his face. It's not like Henry V, hero of Agincourt, conqueror of France. We called him Old Scarface. No one says that. And Bradmore had, among his many miracle operations, had done blepharoplasty. So he'd done eyelid bags. Plastic surgery, we'd call it today. And he had a whole load of potions of his own sort of concoction and devising for healing. So it may be that he had the Charlotte Tilbury magic cream of the day, which that he was good enough to take the arrowhead out. It may be that Henry actually healed pretty well, and it's hard to imagine there was no scar, but it may be that it wasn't. The serious scars, as it were internal.
So Bradmore's real history.
Bradmore's an extraordinary character, yeah.
We're just going to have a quick time out. I just want to pause and just mention the fact that here at the British Library, we have a forthcoming exhibition devoted to the story of medieval women. That's going to be opening on the 25th of October, and it runs until the 2nd of March. And we're going to have a fantastic array of medieval manuscripts on display in the exhibition, including items such as the Book of Marjorie Kemp, the Book of the Queen by Christine de Pizan. Got some amazing loans on display. And if you love your medieval history, got an amazing events program as well. We've got speakers such as Kate Moss and Nina Ramirez are going to be coming to that exhibition, to that events program. So we're delighted to be hosting them. And talking about Henry, moving back to Dan, talking about Henry as a military leader, and I was thinking in particular of, we're talking about him as a warrior, I'm talking about a leader, and I'm wondering about him as a sort of disciplinarian. I'm just really intrigued about the fact that, like, to be successful at this period, you have to have people on your side, and you have to know when to take a harsh line with people. And I wonder whether that plays out in his, as the young king. So now we've actually got to the stage where he's succeeded his father. He's now King of England, 1413, and following that are his great military successes. But, where does one toe the line? We've already touched on him, massacre Agincourt, but thinking about him as a disciplinarian, has that actually come through in the story?
Yes, I think so. Henry is generally consistent, but consistently quite harsh. And discipline is very important to him. And you see that, I won't linger on his childhood too much, excessively in answering this question, but you see it from an early age in Wales. One of the things I didn't mention was he's overseeing the hanging and execution of rebels from his young teens. And as his life goes on, there's the issue of Lollardy, which goes on through his father's reign and into his reign, most famously with John Oldcastle, his friend. Even when he's Prince of Wales, he sort of takes the lead in burning the Evesham tailor John Badby, first person to be burned for Lollardy, following the teachings of John Wycliffe, in a generation. burned in a barrel at Smithfield, and Henry is right there and sort of overseeing things. Then at the start of his reign, there are clear lines and clear rules. Lollardy he makes plain, even as prince, he will have no truck with. And when he becomes king, his friend John Oldcastle makes the error. John Oldcastle, who during Henry's days as prince had been a loyal friend, one of the guys he'd sent out to aid John, Duke of Burgundy, in when England first starts intervening in the Burgundian-Armagnac dispute in France. Oldcastle's one of those sent out. But Oldcastle, once Henry becomes king, makes the error of thinking friendship with Henry will let him do what he wants. And Oldcastle's sort of ordering up whatever kind of Lollard tracts he wants, and he's kind of trading off his friendship with the king. And the bishops come and complain about Oldcastle. Henry says, well, I'll try and have a word with him, and Oldcastle won't listen. And so Henry, well, he goes to the Tower of London and he'll have to be burned. And Henry gives him a reprieve, but then Oldcastle escapes from the Tower of London. And when he's finally run to ground, although this is overseen by John Duke of Bedford, Henry's the third of the four brothers, Oldcastle is dealt with severely. He's burned and hanged at the same time on a Lollard gallows. The same goes for Henry Lord Scrope, a key ally of Henry V during his days as prince. He sits on the royal council when Henry's regent during his father's sequence of illnesses. Just before the Agincourt campaign in 1415, Scrope knows about what becomes known as the Southampton plot, a sort of assembly of all the dank memes of Henry IV's reign, like Splendour, Richard II's alive, the Earl of March should really be king, the French something, whatever. And this is being cooked up in Southampton just as Henry's army is leaving for Harfleur in 15. Turns out Scrope knows about it. Well, the Earl of March tells Henry first, and so Scrope claims, I was about to tell you, I was gathering as much information about this plot as possible, but he doesn't. And even though he's a great pal of Henry's, that doesn't save him. I mean, Henry weeps as he watches him executed in Southampton. He won't allow him to be buried where he wants to be buried. There is no mercy. And towards the end of the campaigns, at one of the many sieges, there's a minor infraction. Every time there's a minor infraction against camp discipline, you can bet somebody on the English side is being hanged on the king's direct orders. It's absolute military discipline, and that's one of the great advantages that the English have in the field. There's this moment it must be just before 1421, where one of these again minor infractions. Henry's the second brother, Thomas Duke of Clarence, goes down on his knees to try and save the life of someone in the army, and Henry says to him, "Brother, even if it were you that had done this, I'd hang you." And so he is an unbelievably strict disciplinarian, but he is consistent. And I think that that is one, you like him or not, he doesn't tend to flip-flop, change his mind, be partisan, partial. It is almost disciplinarianism to a scary degree.
That's incredibly brutal.
Yes, that's true. And that's as I alluded to already, that's often flung at him as a kind of an insult, or rather a criticism of his leadership. It's not really levelled as a criticism of his leadership at the time, and the Agincourt, the slaughtering of the French prisoners at Agincourt is a good case in point. Agincourt has been won by the English, or so it seems. They're gathering up the prisoners, and then it looks like the French are coming back. Who's coming back? People who've fled the field, people who are late to the field, never turned up, some combination. Something like that, probably. We'll never really know. And Henry gives the order. Well, it's annihilation for the English if this is what's happening, because they've got too many French among them. We're going to have to kill them. And that's against the rules of war. No, it's not. The French had taken the oriflamme. Give no quarter, kill them all. So this is an undoubtedly harsh order given on the battlefield, but it is completely justified in that context. This isn't a game of tiddlywinks, And nobody really, well, the criticism is reserved on the French side by French chroniclers for the idiots on the French side who made it look like they were coming back to the battlefield, and that's where the blame is assigned, not to Henry himself. So it's a strange criticism to level at him, given that that was not really what people thought at the time.
Yeah, yeah. And, I mean, it is, of course, one of the most successful English military campaigns in northern France in that particular period after Agincourt and then in Paris. And was that sort of due to Henry's upbringing? Was that due to his military prowess? What was it he had going for him? How did he manage to succeed where others may have failed?
Yes, so, I mean, the closest person, the last person to have attempted anything like what Henry attempts is his great-grandfather, Edward III, who, of course, had staked the first, in a sense, didn't really start the 100 Years' War. These conflicts have been going on, and you can trace them all the way back to Henry II and beyond. But Edward III had changed the game somewhat by staking this claim to the crown of France. But even he had not, as Henry V does in 1420, actually gone and got it. Maybe because Edward III didn't ever really want it. Edward III, I think, it was very useful for him to be able to claim to be King of France because it gave him great leverage in his campaigns to sort of permanently enlarge and secure the borders of Gascony, Aquitaine. Did he genuinely want to become King of France and establish a kind of imperial dual monarchy? I mean, that sounds like a headache. But Henry V interprets it in a far more literal fashion. And we've discussed his training ground in Wales. I think that prepares him very well for the job of leadership in France. He like Edward III, he has a close group of allies and and people he can delegate to. Chief among them, his three brothers, until and then two after Thomas is killed at the Battle of Beaujeu in 1421 of his own folly. He has an enormous amount of luck. As Shakespeare says as the chorus comes on and says in the epilogue to the play Henry V, fortune made his sword. Yes, he was fortunate to become king. He was extremely fortunate to become a warrior king at the time that France was tearing itself asunder in its own version of the Wars of the Roses, in the Burgundian-Armagnac dispute, which spirals from the madness of Charles VI after 1392. France stands wide open. And then again and again, Henry seems to have his back to the wall, sometimes in situations of his own making, as at Agincourt, sometimes at points where he's about to retreat, when his lines are stretched almost all the way to Paris, and he's thinking, how am I going to get out of this? And then John the Fearless is murdered on the bridge at Montereau, and later, as is famously said, this is the hole through which the English entered France. It's said to François Ier. So we've really shown the skull with the hole in it. So he's lucky, but descending into sort of famous quotes now, but what is it? Napoleon, give me lucky generals, or whatever it might be. Yeah. But he makes the most of his luck.
Exactly. And tell us a little bit about his wife. Who does he marry?
Well, he marries Catherine de Valois, the youngest daughter of Charles VI, the sister of Isabella, whom Richard II had married when she was a tiny little girl. And there's a sort of, a circularity to all this. Henry, as a boy, is taken to the negotiations, a sort of proto-field of cloth of gold, when Richard II goes to marry this sort of child bride, and then, almost a generation later, Henry's back, claiming the last of the same king, Charles VI's daughters. Catherine de Valois, she's not really married to him for very long, because it takes until 1420, just less than 2 years before Henry dies, for this marriage to be contracted. Now, if we're talking about criticisms of Henry, one of the better criticisms of Henry is that he leaves it so long to get married. Remember, Bolingbroke had been married as a teenager to a teenager, and they produced 6 children in pretty short order. And they weren't even heirs to the throne at that point. But Henry is fixed from a very early date on Catherine de Valois, because he's also fixed on the idea of the French crown. And this is a key part of the puzzle. So as soon as he's in the military position to force the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, the marriage takes place straight away, and with no hesitation. You know, it's a soldier's wedding. It's in the field. There's no celebration. There's no big party. There's no jousting. Henry says on the day after his wedding, no tournaments. Tournaments cancelled. It's more honourable to go and actually fight so that, you know, poor people may live. As soon as they're married, then she's pregnant, probably becomes pregnant at Kenilworth, again, a very sort of symbolic location for Henry, the place that he'd survived this operation at Bradmore's hands so long ago, the place where he'd built his pleasance, this sort of retreat from the world. And then she gives birth, and the child is Henry VI. But then Henry dies, and all the problem, you know, so the real criticism levelled against Henry V is he caused the Wars of the Roses, didn't he? By... And that's what Shakespeare sort of, again, implies at the end of the play. Because Henry VI, because he leaves it so late to have a child, Henry VI is less than 1 year old when he becomes king. Therefore, there are 17 years of minority. Not only is a minority inherently typically a less stable way of governing a monarchy than actually having an competent adult king, it also means in this specific case, nobody can renegotiate the terms of the deal with the French of 1420. It's frozen for 17 years, and that's a disaster because there can be no flexibility in foreign policy. Had Henry lived for those other 17 years, he could have amended these terms of the Treaty of Troyes as he saw fit, but until Henry VI becomes an adult, nobody can because it would lead them to inevitable charges of being a traitor. So that's the big problem. He leaves it so long to marry Catherine. But in a sense, he also has to, so it's... Yeah.
It is where his personal ambition suddenly gets wrapped up in the history of a country and the destiny of a country and you know, for better or for worse.
Yeah, he does so well for so long to elide, and this, of course, is the job of monarchy, to elide his personal goals with the goals of the realm and to bring the realm along with him. You know, Richard II had never managed to do that. Richard II's personal goals, everyone else went, are you out of your mind? But Henry's sort of, until 1420, but it is this moment of 1420 in the deal when the crown is taken that things start, there's this tension, things start to split. Not only is this war very expensive, it's now a different war. Henry had been claiming what was mine, what was England's, until 1420. In 1420, he's now become the heir and regent to the crown of France. He's going home and asking English parliaments to contribute to a French civil war, him versus the Dauphin. And that's when things get sticky. So he is fortunate in a way. I mean, it's seldom considered fortunate to die of dysentery. But in this case, he gets out while the going's still relatively good.
Of course, he doesn't reign for very long, does he? He's only king for 9 years.
9 years.
But we focus a lot on his kind of military prowess. But no, would you pick up anything that he achieved in the domestic sphere? What was happening sort of with his government, or you know, did he rule in a different way to perhaps other English monarchs of his period?
He takes the Edward III playbook, and it's this idea that foreign policy and domestic policy are identical, or the parts of the same thing, and that unless you have a domestic policy that is about providing law, providing reform, providing remedy to grievance, listening, taking counsel in Parliament, taking counsel in your nobles, building consensus, forget foreign policy, because you won't be able to, no one will pay for it, and you'll be engulfed with domestic problems. I mean, Henry has a sort of, it's interesting at the start of his reign, he has a sort of very sort of Keir Starmer kind of approach to things. He, as soon as the reign begins, he goes after rioters. Like, that's the very first thing he does. He takes the sort of parliament, the judicial system to rioters and goes so hard after rioters he almost collapses he does basically collapse the entire English judicial system through overwork. Then he takes all the money away from the pensioners. Which does. I mean, we're talking about Lancastrian annuitants and retainers, but still, these people thought, oh, this government's always going to look after me. Yeah, forget it, I'm having that, mate. I don't think Keir's going to invade France, unless he's going to reverse Brexit in the most dramatic and unlikely way possible. I don't know if they know what they're doing, so it's still, maybe.
I mean, I had a question on my list, does Henry remind you of any modern politicians? So you've kind of touched on that.
Keir Starmer said at the beginning of his when the riots were happening in England just recently this summer, Starmer said something like, seeing that the law is enforced everywhere is the #1 priority of government. And that's a weird and actually quite chilling thing to say in 2024, when the government, the law is so much more all-encompassing, and the government's power of coercion is so much greater. And I have a separate bunch of concerns about that are probably not for tonight. But Henry V would have approved of that. He'd have, bravo. Seeing that the law is enforced is the top priority of government, because without doing that, forget everything else.
Yeah. So having written this book, I was wondering, what would you say you most admire about Henry V as a man?
I think the ability, and I admire this as a leader, as a politician, and in a sense as a man. I wonder at it as a man, that he has this immense power to subsume himself into the job. In that way, he's a sort of, as a post-war American figure, that the job is everything. The performance of the job is the thing, and he is able to. He just becomes the job, and there's vanishingly little separation between man and performance of the role, and that's what kingship actually demands. When you see the great and the many great explosions of constitutional and political of the Plantagenet years, it's usually because of these human foibles that come in tension with the incredibly difficult demands of the role. Henry just sort of dissolves into the role and becomes this kind of archetypical king and performs it. On his deathbed, I would have rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. Yeah, they all say that. But he had a guy out in Egypt, Syria, Palestine, mapping the coastline and doing diplomatic outreach. The great lost third act of Henry V's reign was, I will be the Crusader king who retakes Jerusalem. It's extraordinary.
Yeah. And so, flipping the coin, any aspects of his personality that you might pick on and say slightly unsettle you?
Well, as a French spy said towards the beginning of his reign, you go for a walk and have a chat to this guy. He's more like a monk than a king, and that's meant as an insult, and it's meant as a disparagement. Almost writing him off as a king, hilariously wrong in that sense. But I think not a. If you want to have a party, right, with the Plantagenet king, give Edward II a call. Man, that guy's like jokes, like straight up jokes, but not good king. You want to have a sort of a discussion about military strategy and maybe some liturgical music playing. This is the guy. Not my kind of person, but then that's neither here nor there. And actually, in that flippant statement is where a lot of history is going wrong at the moment, because not my kind of person has become the sort of the judgment criteria for just so many historians working at the moment. They decide what they like, and they go off sort of waving their finger at the bits of history they don't like, and that's on both sides of the political spectrum. That's not what you're supposed to do, in my opinion.
And he dies really young, doesn't he? Comparatively speaking.
35. Very young, yeah.
So, I know.
35, and not from being deposed and starved to death. Richard II was in his 30s, but.
I often feel it's an advantage to die young, in the sense that your legacy is sort of cemented by what you've achieved up to that point. And people
sounds like you're talking me into euthanasia, Julian.
People don't get the opportunity to see what would have happened when he became slightly more aged, when he'd maybe had a military disaster or two, maybe when people started getting fed up with of him on their throne.
Yeah, you're right. I should just end it all now, shouldn't I? No, of course you're right. Of course you're right. Look, imagine Henry lives as long as Edward III. Nothing lasts forever, does it? This idea, maybe he does go on crusade and then gets his backside handed to him, as even Richard I did. Flip it. Imagine Edward III dies in could be 1348. Imagine Edward III dies of the plague in 48. He's the hero of Sluis, of Crécy, of Calais. Or even imagine he dies in 1360. Add Poitiers, Winchelsea, Treaty of Bretigny to that list. Edward III's stock. Shakespeare's not bothering about Henry V. He's you know, Edward III's the man. But Edward III doesn't, of course. He lives on to 77, and then there's the decline and the falling apart of Bretigny and the Alice Perrers and the sort of... it's a better shape to a story. Henry V's story is actually quite difficult to write because it's an odd shape. It's sort of like this, and then it just kind of stops. It's like the end of The Sopranos. Wait, what happened?
I want to come back to Shakespeare as well. I'm thinking about his legacy. So, you know, I mean, it is still astonishing that we're still talking about somebody who lived 500 years ago. But we know him through the prism of Shakespeare, and we know him also through, you know, particular Shakespearean performances over the years.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether, you know, that perhaps has shaped our perceptions of Henry as a monarch?
Oh, I think undoubtedly. I think, you know, firstly, we're always, when we look at the 15th century, always looking through the lens of Shakespeare. And not just with the sort of individuals. The Richard, you know, the vision of Richard III is the obvious example. Henry V is a good example too. But the whole shape of the 15th century, you know, the idea that in 1399 there's a tear in the fabric of the universe, which can only be resolved through kind of generations of blood feud and bloodshed, and then is eventually redeemed in blood at the Battle of Bosworth. It's one way of looking at it. It's not the only way of looking at it, but Shakespeare's power is so strong with the two tetralogies that there you go, you're kind of in this world. But what Shakespeare's genius is he weaves in and out of truth and fiction, and just makes it so brilliant. I mean, without him, you don't, you know, although the Henry, you know, the various accounts of Henry V's speeches before Agincourt, the one that seems truest to character is that he just said, "Fellas, let's go." You know, you see Branagh dancing between the trees like a little sprite. We few, we happy few. You know, that's this idea is fixed. And I would never in a million years complain about that, because when you're trying to sell, you know this, medieval history is a hard sell, even post Game of Thrones, post, you know, Richard III's being dug up. It's a hard enough sell, and so you know you're looking for things that people have heard of. To sort of, hey, come on, it's okay in this world. It's not just Henry VIII, guys. There's another 7 others. Come on. So if you've heard of Baron, but even if, God, I never thought I'd say this, even if you thought Timothée Chalamet did a good job, by the way, you're fucking out of your mind, isn't it? But even if you labour under that insane delusion, I don't mind, because you can read the real history and enjoy it, and then we've got you. The first hit's for free, and then, you know, give me more. You have to pay for it now.
Which reminds us...
oh, yes. What a good point you make.
Somebody's written a book about it, amazingly. Available in all good bookshops. And you can get your copy afterwards, and Dan's going to sign them. I think that should be a good moment to actually have a pause and actually ask if anybody here tonight... We've got some roving microphones? Roving microphones.
You can rave into them, though.
You can rave into our microphones. I'm going to look at... So if anybody would like to ask a question this evening, I'll have a show of hands. A couple of microphones over here. So, I'm going to start with the lady in the black here, because you're nearest the microphone, that lady there, and then I'll take the other people moving around. Okay, question with Dan, please.
Hello, all the way from America.
Hello, all the way from America.
So you have a couple of odd books, not odd, but I know you have some more creative books that you've written. You've written about the Plantagenets, Crusaders, and a biography now, and fiction. So if you could only write one style for the rest of your life, do you get asked this all the time?
No.
For the rest of your life, what would it be?
Now I'm confused, because I don't have a stock answer to give you with rehearsed jokes. Okay, no. What do I like doing? I like writing big, sweeping stories. However, what you're asking here is a terrible torment, a sort of Dante-esque, you're putting me into one of the circles of purgatory, where I'm condemned to roll the rock up the hill forever or whatever, or be dangled by my toes in such and such. I love writing big sweeping, the Plantagenets, Wars of the Roses, Powers and Thrones, books I love. But as soon as I've done one of those, I'm like hopping around to do something different. And that's why I wanted to write a biography for so long. And I was itching to write the fiction eventually, and I'm finishing the third in the Essex Dogs trilogy. And there was a bit of me that was going, you can write 7 of these, 8 of these, 20 of these. And I'm like, no, I've got this completely different idea. And that's also the thing that I like. So it's really hard. If whatever I say, I'm going to end up dissatisfied with, because I like to sort of change and test myself, and that's my thing.
Thank you. I think there's a lady at the back just holding her hand there. Thank you.
I was wondering, do you think he could have taken Jerusalem?
Me? I don't fucking go anywhere near that right now.
Maybe not right
See
now.
what's going on? Him?
Henry V, yeah.
No. Well, look, if anyone could, very difficult. I mean, you can see why he's thinking it. One thing we didn't talk about was 1417, the papal schism ends. And of course, a lot of that work is Sigismund, the Holy Roman Emperor, who Henry pals up with. The mood music is getting there, but history would say that many gave it a shot, and see the Templars, but after the 1291, it's sort of over, really. So I think that he would have given it a very good go. And it may even have sort of come close to Richard the Lionheart, in the sense that after Richard the Lionheart had departed the East in his day, so it was said, mothers with restless children who wouldn't go to bed at night used to say to them, you go to sleep or King Richard will come and get you. That maybe the same would have been said about Henry, but I think that no. And you're also looking at just exactly the same thing as, I'm going to conquer the crown of France. What if he did do it? What then? Oh my God, what a nightmare. You now got, just as the first Crusaders discovered, you win it. Now you've got to hold on to it. It's
There's a question down here in the front row, please. Just wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Well, firstly, thank you both for a very entertaining conversation. You were very dismissive about the dual monarchy, or the prospects of a dual monarchy, and you can't underestimate the challenges, but it worked for the Habsburgs.
That's true. It's not an impossible task. I mean, as John Duke of Bedford shows, I mean, from 1422 to 1429, they're sort of starting to make it kind of work, but then Joan of Arc comes along, but once the Burgundians defect in 1435 back to the French cause, it just becomes very, very difficult to maintain. I mean, Henry I think that the solution lay in the structure of the family for Henry, in that, he I think was aware you could put Bedford in France, and you could have Gloucester, Humphrey of Gloucester in England, and you could have him sort of, whether it's not really on crusade or sort of sitting at the top of this pyramid, small pyramid, admittedly, but it would have presented enormous challenges, and the histories of the two realms, as a result of the 100 Years' War, by this stage, were diverging, and the Channel was becoming a dividing line. If you go back to sort of early Plantagenet, the early Plantagenet era, where you had the sort of the Anglo-Norman realm as a concept, cross-channel landholding, cross-channel culture, united by the aristocratic language of French. But actually, Henry himself had done a lot through his use of English to write letters home to sort of culturally define Englishness in opposition to Frenchness. So that it would have been an enormously difficult task, I think. But, you can never write it off as impossible.
Okay, we've got a couple of gentlemen here, so perhaps on the man with the white shirt first.
Thanks both for... it's working. Thanks both for a great conversation. Actually, this leads on very well from the previous point you were saying. Does your book, I'm yet to purchase and enjoy it, does your book touch upon the sort of land settlement in Normandy? Henry's very keen, for example, to expel lots of Frenchmen from Caen or Harfleur, bring in Englishmen. And so again, there's a slightly dichotomous nature of him using English as a language, identifying as an English king of England, and also then as a French king of France with different outfits and different rituals. Yet he's also mixing both by settling Englishmen, and there's a whole colonial element to his rule. I just wonder what you have to say on that, and was it ever anything other than just a bit of a disaster, really, for the subsequent generations of making peace? Because you can't make peace in the 1430s easily, because you've got these Englishmen who are propertied and so on.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, the focus of the book is tight to Henry, but these issues are incredibly important to the vision of what are you actually trying to achieve here, and by what means. And I think that as that pertains to the biographical side of the book, there's this development as his campaigns go on, in which he cannot stop barreling forward. And it's this individual momentum of he just keeps on winning. And when he goes home, leaving Thomas of Clarence in charge, Clarence rides headlong into Beaujais and gets himself killed. So that's the kind of psychological drive and narrative. And alongside that just come policies that are not made up on the hop, but certainly are made with expedience in mind, and then have to be sort of, thought over quite carefully afterwards. And that, again, we come back to the abrupt death leaves everyone very much in the lurch. And that's whilst he's in charge, it's his thing. Agincourt is this in microcosm. He's the only one who wants to go marching north after Harfleur. But everyone comes along with him. And while he's there, they just seem to keep winning. So it's no matter what risks you take or measures you adopt under Henry, things seem to be like they're going to be okay. But I think you're right. This legacy to future generations is difficult. And Bedford being in charge in the later 20s, I think Bedford is almost Henry's equal. And he does manage to make a decent go of it, I think. And they're starting to get somewhere with this idea of a re-Anglicised Normandy that at least will pay for its own defence. It's starting to prove not impossible. But everything is an order of magnitude more difficult without Henry himself.
Yeah, pass it around.
Thank you so much. I suspect the answer to this is buy the book and read it.
That's the answer to everything.
But
subtext.
I'm genuinely very interested in the domestic side of rule, and I know, obviously, in the context of medieval kingship, foreign and the domestic kind of blend and whatnot. But I wonder whether there's something to be explored in his patronage of arts and architecture. I know King's College Chapel in Cambridge. Was there anything in your book that led you down that line of inquiry?
Well, Henry's great projects are monastic. I mean, he's interested in monastic reform in a way that's actually really quite old-fashioned. It's interesting to see him. There's this moment when he's prince, when Lollardy is, this proposal that we should, have a radical Lollard reform, strip all the land and possessions, away, defund the church, as it were. and use this for a sort of reinvigorization of society, you know, endow lots of new universities and stuff. There's a moment where Henry could have latched onto that, and instead he sort of carefully, cannily, around the time of burning Badby, moves away from it, and thereafter it's, you know, it's monastic reforms at Sion and new monastic orders. And I wouldn't place him in. I mean, King's College and Eton are Henry VI rather than Henry V. So it's the you can't compare him to a Henry III or a Henry VI. Or even a Richard II. I mean, Richard, you walk into Westminster Hall today and sort of look up at the ceiling, and there you have kind of Richard II. Henry's typically better at blowing things up. No worries.
Okay, yeah, actually, there's a gentleman. We'll bring the microphone back to you both in a moment. The gentleman in the black shirt has had his hand up. Thank you.
Thanks, it was a very good talk. I was at Pembroke on Friday, celebrating 40 years since I started my degree, and probably ought to use this a bit more. But I was just thinking that when you look at the Shakespearean speech for Henry V, that wouldn't really probably work too well with the Essex dogs. So have you any intention of rewriting it? And do you think, given your article in BBC History, there might be a bit more sort of creative swearing in there?
of Henry's speech?
Of Henry's speech, I think he might drop a few sort of...
Oh, yes, a few
more Alex Ferguson than Shakespearean.
Yes. Yes. I think that the Fellas Let's Go is quite a... I think that was quite an Essex Dogs payoff, that one. That you have this, you know, in those novels where I'm always trying to kind of subvert and joke and play around with your historical expectation. The idea of a king who's everyone's waiting for him to give this kind of rhetorical speech and gee them all up, and he goes, "Come on, then." I mean, that's my favourite kind of joke. But that's for the novels. I'm back in that world at the moment because I'm writing the third one, and yes, it's rather good fun. I think the thing, if you want to see Henry V, the Shakespearean soliloquies of Henry V rewritten in the style of Dan Jones's Essex Dogs, ChatGPT is your friend.
Perfect. I've got an online question that's going to...
Yeah, in fact, we have a couple of online questions that are sort of related, moving from Shakespeare into the world of film. Mary asks, do you think My Own Private Idaho has anything useful to say about the making of Henry V? I believe that's the 1991 movie, if you can remember it. And Lydia asks, hi Dan, which actor has played your favourite version of Henry V? Mine is Tom Hiddleston.
Oh, another Pembroke man. I mean, I like Branagh. I think, you know, Branagh's great. That voice is so... I saw Kit Harington do it on stage not so long ago. He was all right, but it was a bit of unfortunate timing, because it was all done in modern dress with like plastic AK-47s, and it was right as the war in Ukraine started, and they all just said, "Oh no, doesn't." So that was just unfortunate timing. So it was quite a good production. I thought Hiddleston did kind of great. It's a kind of a Marvel performance. It's like it's tough. And Olivier looks very, dated now. It's that great Technicolor age. And Branagh for me is just sort of sweet spot in the middle. No Chalamet, never Chalamet. Hashtag never Chalamet. Jude Law. Jude Law was good on stage, was he? I wish I'd seen that. As for the other one, I don't know. I don't know what that's all about. I feel like Mary has an opinion on that question, which she might be hoping I'll echo, but I can't read what I'm expected to say from it.
Anyway, My Own Private Idaho is the film. It's an adaptation, Hollywood version of Shakespeare.
Okay, well, go home and watch that.
More questions, please. Okay, there's... and then I come back to you, Lee. Just over here first.
Hi. I'm curious, when you write a book like this, and you put so much passion into it, write about a subject that you know so well, like what is how are you going to measure success for this book beyond sales, beyond what would be a normal measure? Like, how do you know that you got it right of any movie? Obviously not Timothée Chalamet. You know, what does that look like? Is it that you hear from other scholars, or is it that you hear from folks you never thought, or you know, what is that measure? Because this is a lot of work, and it is intimidating also to read, just as somebody who's not as adept in all the kings that you're mentioning, right? So is it folks like me? Like, how do you track bringing this into kind of like what success looks like, bringing it into kind of more pop culture, maybe, or?
That's great. I didn't expect to be in therapy. That's a really perceptive question, and I don't think anyone's ever asked me that. Like that. That's an amazing question, and I don't know if I can give you a specific answer. I don't get really hung up on reviews anymore. I did when I was younger, but I don't care at all, really, about professional reviewers. That's not my metric. Sales, really, I mean, they're important in that there is a commercial. This is my job, so that matters. But that's not, that doesn't last. You get this is going to sound really wishy-washy. You get a sort of. I love doing these events because it is so. You only really start to learn about a book when people read it, and sort of you start to amass actually, coming and meeting real people, talking about books. But that takes a long time. So it's often, I'll come around and talk to readers, when we're signing books or whatever, and people talk about the Plantagenets. And I'm of such advanced years now that people are coming and saying, "Oh, I read the Plantagenets when I was sort of a teenager, and now I'm like 30 or whatever, and I've loved history ever since." Or you find you've had people will come up and say, "Hey, you had this like really important effect in my life at some point." And I, particularly if I'm sort of tired or drunk, I get very moved by that. I'm moved almost to tears, and those sort of stick a bit. But I think that ultimately, you end up having a sort of personal kind of feeling about books that's only really revealed over time. And sometimes that's about how you felt as a person when you were writing them. Like things will happen at certain moments in your life that you only you will really remember, and or a book will have unlocked something in terms of overall writing. I remember writing The Hollow Crown. That came out in 2014. That was the third book I wrote, and I felt like when I wrote that book, I was like, I get it. I get what I'm doing here. The first two, I'd felt very out of control and just like flying by the seat of my pants. And not necessarily imposter syndrome, but just like, shit, I'm learning on the job. And this is like, I'm flying the plane, and I don't know how to fly planes. And I just, this is really scary. And then by the third book, I was like, I sort of planned it. I executed exactly as I wanted to. I felt in control on a sentence level, a structural level. The book kind of landed. I just was. And so I remember that book really fondly. And when people bring them to signings and hand it over, I'm like, wow, I feel this sort of thing. And then I remember like writing The Templars, and that did commercially very well. And I liked writing that book. And I think, wow, I had some insane experiences after writing that book with real Templars coming up to me and sending me their compromat of the head of this branch of the Templars, like secret caches of paparazzi shots with their secret boyfriend in Mexico getting tattoos. And I'm like, why did I write this book? I didn't want to see this stuff. So I have a different emotional response to that one. You didn't come here expecting therapy either, did you? So like you were having to listen to this and go, and how did that make you feel? That's an amazing question. Thank you for asking that, because I've really enjoyed answering it. I don't know if I've given you anything, but
there's a lady
I'm
here
burdened.
who's been extraordinarily patient. Can we just pass the microphone? Do you want to put a hand up here? Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting talk. I was wondering, on a narrative writing style, this is very different to the previous ones, particularly once you compare what is it now, 3-4 years back to Thrones and Powers.
Yeah, Powers and Thrones. Yeah.
In between there, you've written 2 fiction books, which is, again, a very different style. Do you think that's had an impact on the style, or just that this is a biography and therefore a different subject matter?
Yeah, I've thought about that's another great question, and I don't know that I can really answer it because I feel like I'm still too close to this. And when I started writing those novels, the Essex Dogs and Wolves of Winter novels, people kept asking me, hey, do you think this is going to change the way you write non-fiction? I said, I don't know, ask me when I've written some non-fiction. And now, unfortunately, that moment's here, and I still don't know the answer. I certainly, I don't really have a good control, if you see it in a sort of science experiment. Had I gone and written another very similar book to Powers and Thrones, another big sweeping sort of macro history, then I might have been able better to answer. But I picked a style for this biography that I felt was specifically right for the task of medieval biography, which, as I've been talking about tonight, I feel is a difficult or a challenging sort of thing to do. So I think maybe my instinct is that having written fiction, I sort of gained, and this maybe talks a little bit to the question, the last question. Maybe what writing fiction did was kind of add a degree of sort of confidence in, well, I can actually do something really quite different stylistically, and that's fine, that's great, that's okay. I'm confident enough to do that rather than say, well, shit, the Plantagenets did well, or that 4-part structure that I used for Hollow Crown and Templars and those chapter shapes, those kind of landed, so I better repeat that. It's the sort of confidence to go, well, look, now I have a range of things I know that I can do. What's best for this story? Let's just do that, and then have the confidence to put it out there and trust that because I responded well when I was sitting down and reading this and editing it and thinking about it and trying to analyse my own work. Trust that readers will share that response. Now, that could just be a sort of general fact of getting more experienced and older, or it could well have something to do with fiction, or it could be both. I don't know. I'm still trying to puzzle it out. But thank you for that question.
Might need to write a few more books first then to work it out.
I know. I do. I actually do. The deadline's looming.
Do we have time for one more? Okay, there's a lady at the back, and then we'll round up. Thank you. Final question.
Fascinating talks this evening. Can you remember the first primary source medieval document you looked at? And do you still have that, what I assume, as you've stayed as a medieval historian, joy when you look at a primary document of that privilege, that bloody hell, this is so old and I still get... Does that still stay?
I can remember... It might not be the first, but I have a vivid memory of starting writing the Peasants' Revolt book and going through... the sort of snippets of legal records from the trials and the aftermath of the Peasants' Revolt, and the letters that had been found on John Ball in his pockets when he was picked up. The preacher, when Adam delved and Eve span. These cryptic letters trying to raise the rebels across the country. Yeah, and I thought, wow, that really, that emotion, that had an emotional effect on me as well as the being useful for the task of writing the book. And in answer to the second part of your question, absolutely, yeah. I was at the National Archives a few weeks ago because I'm writing this last Essex Dogs novel, and it's set in 1350, around the events leading up to the Battle of Winchelsea, big sea battle between Edward III and a Castilian fleet. And there's not much work has been done on the Battle of Winchelsea, and particularly the months. So from the sort of around the time of St George's Day to this April through August 1350, and I had some specific things I was interested in about where the court was, where Edward III's court was, what they were up to, and whether they were having big parties, because just post-pandemic, there was a lavish. aristocratic kind of parties at court. And I thought, what is going on in there? And I went down the National Archives and sat with the brilliant Paul Dryberg, and we just got out all the Great Wardrobe accounts from this year. And you could see what people were bringing to court when they came to visit Edward III. And by and large, the gift to bring was cloth, bolts of the finest, most expensive cloth you could afford. Enough, certainly, that he could make matchy-matchy outfits with Queen Philippa. And they were these sort of, you start to see from the expenses to his tailor in particular, what he's making these bolts of cloth into. The sort of 7-piece robe with it's got the gloves and the gown and the thing and the sort of matching pants, and so she's got a version, and it's the embroidery that's in it, and then there are the accounts for the fitting out, because it's a book about a naval battle, the fitting out of the kingship Jerusalem, the feather bed that's in there in the king's cabin, and the hangings and the awnings, and so suddenly, wow, this world is coming to life, and there's the thing of, geez, how many people have looked at this sort of handwritten royal account since it was written? Probably you can count them on your fingers. So yeah, that joy, that sort of fascination, that emotional response, which is separate to the business of the writing, but is a sort of a fringe benefit, if you like, of the job. I do still feel it, yeah. And I will certainly be coming to Julian's exhibition to see those amazing documents that you were mentioning, Christine de Pizan and all of that. I mean, that's what's so wonderful about living in or around a city like London and having places like the British Library, is that you know, exhibitions like this take place and you can go in and everybody can share in that experience. And if I'm not really a sort of missionary for anything very much, but if there's one thing I enjoy seeing, it's people getting excited about history. And there are few better ways to do so than by communing with documents, the stuff of history.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your passion with us tonight. Delighted to
Many's
say...
the lady that's... Oh, sorry, nothing.
Go on.
Nothing. No, I was going to make a lewd comment. It would have ruined the end of the night, Julian. Would have been cancelled.
And as we say, you can come and get your own. For those of you who haven't yet read it, buy your copies and get them signed outside by Dan now. A massive round of applause. Dan.